The shuttle docked at Korath Prime with a low hum that rattled through the metal walls, and Sergeant Elias Ward stepped out into the largest military academy he had ever seen in his life. The station stretched in every direction like a small city floating in space, with corridors wide enough for 3 trucks to drive side by side, and ceilings so high that birds could have flown beneath them without ever touching the top. Aliens of every shape and size moved through the hallways with purpose and pride, wearing uniforms that marked them as cadets or officers or staff of the Galactic Union Military Academy. Elias wore no such uniform. He carried a single bag over his shoulder and a transfer order on his datapad that told him everything he needed to know about his new life here. He was not a cadet, and he was not an officer, and he was not even close to being treated like a soldier. He was custodial support, a janitor. Finally accepted humanity into its military structure after years of petitions and negotiations and political fighting. But they had not accepted humans as warriors. They had buried them in the lowest roles they could find, and Elias had drawn the short straw. His assignment was Training Hall 7, the close-quarters combat wing, where the best melee fighters in the galaxy trained under the watchful eye of senior instructor Vorath Kell. Elias had read the file on Vorath during the shuttle ride. Vorath was a Draenok, one of the reptilian species that dominated galactic combat rankings, standing nearly 7 feet tall with scales like dark iron, and arms thick enough to crush stone. The Draenok were famous across every known system as the finest hand-to-hand fighters any species had ever produced, and Vorath was considered one of the best among them. He had trained warriors for over 40 years, and had personally fought in 3 major conflicts. Found Training Hall 7 after getting lost twice in the maze of corridors, and asking directions from a 4-armed alien who looked at him like he was an insect. The hall was enormous, with sparring rings marked on the floor in glowing lines, and weapon racks along every wall, holding staffs and blunted blades and shock pikes, and things Elias had no name for. Vorath was standing in the center of the hall, watching 2 cadets spar when Elias walked in. The instructor turned his massive head and looked down at the human with golden eyes that held no warmth and no curiosity and no interest at all. "You are the new custodial unit," Vorath said, and it was not a question. "Yes, sir," Elias said. Vorath pointed one clawed finger toward a supply closet in the far corner. "Your equipment is there, your schedule is posted on the door, and your quarters are on sub-level 9 with the other support staff," Vorath said, already turning back to his cadets. "Interfere with training, and do not speak to cadets during active sessions, and do not touch the weapons." Elias nodded and walked to the supply closet, and opened it, and found a mop and a bucket and a set of cleaning solutions, labeled in a language he could barely read. He filled the bucket and started mopping the far end of the hall. Nobody looked at him. Nobody cared. And that was fine with Elias, because Elias was very good at being invisible. What the Galactic Union did not know, and what Vorath did not know, and what nobody on this station knew, was that Elias Ward had spent 12 years in the United Earth Marine Corps before humanity ever made contact with alien life. He had done 2 full combat tours on Earth during conflicts that would mean nothing to these aliens, and he had trained in more fighting disciplines than most people could name. He held black belts in 3 martial arts and instructor certifications in 2 more. Spent 6 years teaching hand-to-hand combat to other Marines before the aliens arrived and everything changed. But none of that mattered here. His Earth credentials were listed in the Union database as unverifiable primitive world experience, which was a polite way of saying they thought humans were too weak and too small and too soft to fight anything worth fighting. So, Elias mopped floors. He mopped them in the morning before the cadets arrived, and he mopped them in the evening after they left. And sometimes he mopped them during sessions, when someone bled or spilled something or cracked a floor tile with a bad throw. He was always there, always quiet, always watching. The cadets were a mix of species that made Elias feel like he had stepped into a nature documentary from another dimension. The Draenei were the largest group, reptilian and proud, and built like tanks, with natural armor plating on their forearms and shins. Insectoid. Fast and precise, with multiple limbs that could strike from angles that seemed impossible. The Molvari were the heavy hitters, ape-like creatures from high-gravity worlds who stood 8 feet tall and could bench press a small vehicle without breaking a sweat. And then there were a few others, species Elias was still learning the names of, each with their own natural weapons and advantages. Every single one of them was bigger than Elias. Every single one of them was stronger than Elias. And every single one of them looked at him like he was furniture. One cadet in particular seemed to enjoy reminding Elias of his place. His name was Nivar, a young Draenei from a noble family, with scales polished to a shine and an attitude that screamed privilege from across the room. On Elias's 3rd day, Nivar walked across a freshly mopped section of floor, stopped in the middle of it, and deliberately poured an entire container of nutrient gel onto the clean surface. The thick green liquid spread across the floor in a wide puddle. Nivar looked at Elias and smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "You missed a spot, little creature," Nivar said, and the cadets around him laughed. Elias looked at the puddle and then looked at Nivar, and then dipped his mop into the bucket and started cleaning without a word. Nivar snorted and walked away, but if anyone had been watching closely, and almost nobody was, they would have noticed something small but important. As Elias cleaned the spill, his grip on the mop handle shifted. It was subtle, barely visible, but the way his hands spaced themselves along the wooden shaft was not the way a janitor holds a mop. It was the way a fighter holds a staff weapon. His fingers found their positions from muscle memory built over thousands of hours of practice. And for just a moment, his stance widened and his weight dropped, and his shoulders squared in, a way that turned a cleaning tool into something else entirely. Then the moment passed and he was just a janitor again, pushing a mop across a dirty floor in a place where nobody thought he belonged. Across the hall, Vorath had turned to bark an order at a sparring pair, but something made him pause. He glanced back at the human. The janitor was mopping, head down, shoulders relaxed, just another piece of the background. But Vorath had trained warriors for 40 years, and there was something in the back of his mind now, a tiny question that had no shape yet, but refused to go away. He watched the human for 3 more seconds, and then turned back to his cadets and said nothing. The question stayed. 3 weeks passed, and Elias became part of the furniture of Training Hall 7. He arrived before anyone else each morning, and left after everyone else each night. And in between, he cleaned and maintained and organized, and stayed silent, while some of the most dangerous fighters in the galaxy trained all around him. He learned their rhythms the way a musician learns a song, by listening and watching until the patterns became obvious. The Draenei cadets fought with raw power and overwhelming aggression, using their natural armor to absorb hits while they closed distance and crushed their opponents with strikes that could dent steel. The Thessari fought like dancers, their multiple limbs creating webs of fast strikes and parries that were beautiful and deadly at the same time. The Molvari fought like avalanches, slow to start, but impossible to stop once they got moving, relying on their massive size and high-gravity muscles to simply bulldoze anything in their path. Vorath taught them all with a strict hand and a sharp tongue, correcting form and punishing laziness and pushing every cadet to their limit. He was a good instructor. Elias could see that clearly. Vorath understood leverage and timing and the way a fight flows from one moment to the next, and he taught these things with the confidence of someone who had lived them in real combat. But Elias also saw the gaps. Vorath taught each species to fight to their strengths, which made sense, but he never taught them to fight against their weaknesses. The Draenei relied so heavily on their armor that they left their unprotected joints exposed. The Thessari were fast but fragile, and a single solid hit to their thorax could end a fight instantly. The Molvari were powerful, but slow to change direction, and anyone quick enough to get behind them would find a creature that could not turn fast enough to respond. Elias saw all of this and said nothing and kept mopping. Then one afternoon everything changed because of a bad throw. Two cadets were sparring in the third ring, a Draenok and a Thessary named Chirik. Chirik was one of the smaller cadets, an insectoid with iridescent wings folded tight against their back, and four arms that moved like whips when they fought. The Draenok cadet grabbed Chirik during a grapple exchange and threw them hard, too hard, with bad technique that sent the Thessaries spinning sideways instead of flat. Chirik hit the ground at a bad angle, and there was a sound like a branch cracking, and then a high-pitched clicking noise that Elias had learned was the Thessary equivalent of a scream. The cadets nearby froze. The Draenok who had made the throw stepped back with wide eyes. Vorath was across the hall, working with another group, and started moving immediately, but the hall was large, and he was far away. Elias was close, crossed the distance in 4 quick steps, and knelt beside Chirik, who was clicking and writhing on the floor, with one of their thoracic joints bent at an angle that was clearly wrong. "Hold still," Elias said, in a calm voice that cut through the panic like a blade. "You have dislocated your second thoracic joint on the left side, and I need you to stop moving so I can stabilize it before the surrounding muscles lock up." Chirik's compound eyes focused on him through the pain. The cadets standing around them stared. The human janitor was touching the injured Thessary with hands that moved with practiced confidence, finding the joint by feel, applying pressure in exactly the right place, supporting the limb so it would not shift further. "Breathe through your spiracles, slow and steady," Elias said. "This is going to feel very wrong for about 2 seconds, and then much better." He did something quick and precise with both hands, and Chirik let out one sharp click and then went quiet. The joint was back in place. Chirik flexed the limb slowly, testing it, and clicked softly in surprise. Vorath arrived 10 seconds later, pushing through the circle of stunned cadets, and found the Thessary sitting up, with the human janitor already stepping back toward his mop. "What happened?" Vorath demanded. "Bad throw, dislocated thoracic joint already stabilized," Elias said without looking up as he picked up his mop. "Should probably get checked by medical to make sure the cartilage is not torn." Vorath stared at him. The cadets stared at him. Elias started mopping a spot nearby that did not need mopping. Later that evening, after all the cadets had gone, Vorath found Elias in the supply closet, organizing cleaning solutions. The big Draenok filled the entire doorway, blocking the light. "Thessary thoracic anatomy is not taught in any custodial training program," Vorath said, his voice low and direct. Elias did not look up from the bottles he was arranging. "Humans pick things up fast," he said. "That was a field stabilization technique," Vorath said. "I have seen combat medics perform it, and most of them do it worse than you did today." "I read a lot," Elias said. Vorath stood there for a long moment, his golden eyes searching the human's face for something, and then he turned and walked away without another word. But the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind for 3 weeks was no longer small and shapeless. It was growing. 2 nights later, Elias made a mistake. It was past midnight, and the training hall was empty and dark, except for the low emergency lights along the floor, and Elias had finished his cleaning duties an hour ago, but he had not left. He stood in the center of the main sparring ring with the mop in his hands. For 30 seconds he was still, breathing slowly, centering himself. Then he moved. The mop handle became a staff weapon, and Elias flowed through a kata that blended 3 different martial arts into something fluid and devastating. He struck invisible targets at head height and knee height and throat height, spun the staff behind his back and caught it without looking, swept low and thrust high, and moved with a speed and precision that would have made any instructor in any military on Earth sit up and take notice. A mop handle whistled through the air as he accelerated, his footwork carrying him across the ring in patterns that were not random, but were instead the muscle memory of 10,000 hours of practice. He transitioned from staff work into empty-hand combinations, shadowboxing with a rhythm that mixed boxing jabs with Muay Thai elbows with Marine Corps close-quarters takedowns, moving like something between a dancer and a machine. His breathing was controlled, and his eyes were focused on enemies that were not there, and his body moved with the kind of easy violence that only comes from years and years of dedicated training. He went for 15 minutes without stopping. Then he felt it, that prickle at the back of his neck, that every combat veteran knows, the animal awareness that says, someone is watching you. He stopped mid-strike and stood perfectly still, the mop handle held at his side, his eyes scanning the dark hall. Nothing moved. He waited 10 more seconds, and then let out a slow breath, and picked up his bucket, and walked to the supply closet as if nothing had happened. High above the sparring floor, on the observation balcony that ringed the upper level of the hall, Shirik pressed their body flat against the railing, and held perfectly still. Their compound eyes, designed to see in near total darkness, had captured everything. Every strike, every spin, every movement that the human janitor had made with a cleaning tool that he wielded like a master wielded a sacred weapon. Chiric's mandibles clicked once, very softly, in the darkness. It was the Thessari sound for a word that did not translate perfectly into any other language, but meant something close to impossible. The next morning, Chirik arrived at Training Hall 7 early and found Elias mopping the entrance corridor. "I need to speak with you," Chirik said. "Good morning to you too," Elias said. "I saw you last night," Chirik said, "in the training ring, after midnight, with the mop." Elias's hands did not stop moving, but his shoulders tightened just slightly. "I was cleaning the ring," he said. "You were not cleaning anything," Chirik said, and there was no accusation in the Thessari's voice, only wonder. "You were fighting, and you were fighting better than anyone I have ever seen in this academy." Elias finally stopped mopping and looked at Chirik. His eyes were calm, but there was something behind them now, something careful and guarded. "You should forget what you saw," Elias said quietly. "I cannot," Chirik said. "Thessari have perfect visual memory, and what I saw last night is now part of me forever." Elias closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked very tired. "Then keep it to yourself," he said. "Please." Chirik tilted their head in the way that Thessari do when they are thinking hard about something. "Why are you hiding?" Chirik asked. Elias looked down the corridor to make sure no one else was near. "Because if I am not a janitor, then I am a threat," he said. "And if I am a threat, then the Union has a reason to revoke humanity's provisional status and send every human on this station back to Earth. And I am not going to let my pride put my entire species at risk." He picked up his mop and walked away. Chirik watched him go and said nothing. But the Thessari had already made a decision, and it was not the one Elias wanted. Chirik went straight to Vorath. Elias did not know this until it was too late, and by then the wheels were already turning in a direction he could not stop. The Thessari cadet found the senior instructor in his private office, adjacent to Training Hall 7, a sparse room decorated with nothing except weapons mounted on the walls and a single chair that was built to hold a Draenok's weight. Chirik stood at attention and told Vorath everything: the midnight training session, the staff work, the hand-to-hand combinations, the speed and the precision, and the way the human moved like he had been born fighting. Vorath listened without interrupting, his golden eyes fixed on the small insectoid cadet. his clawed hands resting on his knees. When Chirik finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "You are certain of what you saw," Vorath finally said. "Thesari do not misremember," Chirik said. "My visual memory is flawless, and what I saw was a warrior of exceptional skill, pretending to be a janitor." Vorath leaned back in his chair, and it creaked under his weight. The question that had been growing in his mind for weeks now had a shape and a name, and it demanded an answer. He stood up and walked out of his office, and crossed the training hall to where Elias was wiping down a weapon rack with a cloth. "Human," Vorath said. "Sir," Elias said without turning around. "Walk with me." It was not a request. They walked to the far end of the hall, where no cadets were training, past the last sparring ring, into a corridor that led to a storage area that nobody used. Vorath stopped and turned, and looked down at the human from his full height of nearly 7 feet. "One of my cadets tells me that you have combat training," Vorath said. "Significant combat training, demonstrated in my hall, after hours, using a cleaning implement as a weapon." Elias's face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Cadets say a lot of things," Elias said carefully. "This particular cadet has perfect visual memory and is not prone to exaggeration," Vorath said. "I have also watched you myself these past weeks, human, and I have seen things that do not add up." He held up one clawed finger. "The way you stabilized the Thesari joint was not luck, and it was not something you read in a manual." A second finger. "The way you hold your cleaning tool changes depending on who is sparring nearby, as if you are unconsciously mirroring combat stances." A third finger. "And the way you watch my cadets is not the way a janitor watches fighters. It is the way a fighter watches other fighters, looking for weaknesses." Elias said nothing. Vorath lowered his hand. "So here is what is going to happen," Vorath said, and his voice was not angry, but it was absolutely firm. "You are going to step onto my training floor, and you are going to demonstrate whatever it is you know in front of my cadets today." "With respect, sir, I cannot do that," Elias said. "This is not optional," Vorath said. "It has to be," Elias said, and for the first time his voice had an edge to it. "I am here as custodial staff, and if I step outside that role, the Union could use it as grounds to review humanity's provisional membership. And I am not willing to risk that." Vorath studied him for a long moment. "And if you refuse," Vorath said slowly, "then I have a cadet who came to me with what appears to be a fabricated story about a custodial worker performing advanced combat techniques in an unauthorized area after hours, and I would be required to discipline that cadet for wasting my time with fantasy." Elias's jaw tightened. "You would punish Chirik for telling the truth," he said. "I would punish a cadet for making an unsubstantiated claim," Vorath said, "unless, of course, the claim is substantiated, which would require a demonstration." The two of them stood there in that empty corridor, and something passed between them that was older than language. It was the silent understanding between two fighters who recognize each other across any distance and through any disguise. Vorath knew exactly what he was doing. He was not being cruel. He was pulling a warrior out of hiding, and he was using the only leverage he had to do it. Elias looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then back at Vorath. "If I do this," Elias said quietly, "and it goes wrong, it is not just me who pays the price." "If you are what the Thesari says you are," Vorath replied, "then nothing will go wrong." Elias closed his eyes. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to walk away, to stay small, to stay invisible, to keep pushing the mop and keep his head down and protect the fragile political thread that connected humanity to the rest of the galaxy. But Chirik had told the truth, and Chirik would be punished for it, and Elias could not let that happen. He opened his eyes. "Fine," he said. 1 hour later, the full class was assembled in Training Hall 7. 36 cadets stood in formation around the main sparring ring, a mix of Draenok and Thessari and Malvari and a handful of other species, all of them curious about why Instructor Vorath had called an unscheduled assembly. Vorath stood at the edge of the ring with his arms crossed. "It has come to my attention," he said in a voice that filled the entire hall, "that our custodial support may have some passing familiarity with combat techniques." A ripple of laughter moved through the cadets. Nevar, the Draenok noble, who had spilled nutrient gel on Elias's clean floor 3 weeks ago, grinned wide enough to show every one of his teeth. "In the interest of thoroughness," Vorath continued, "I have asked the human to provide a brief demonstration so that we may evaluate whatever primitive skills his species possesses." More laughter. Elias walked out of the supply closet and into the ring. He was still wearing his custodial coveralls. He was still holding his mop. The laughter got louder. Vorath gestured toward the weapon rack on the near wall. "You may select a training weapon," he said. Elias looked at the rack. There were staffs made of reinforced alloy that could withstand a Molvai's full strength, blunted swords with weighted blades designed for Draenok hands, shock pikes that hummed with low-level electrical charges, and half a dozen other weapons designed for species much larger and much stronger than any human. Elias looked at the weapons, and then looked down at the mop in his hands. It was a standard cleaning mop, with a wooden handle about 5 feet long, and a head of synthetic fibers at the bottom. It weighed almost nothing. It was designed to clean floors. "This will do," Elias said. The laughter stopped being amused and became something closer to mockery. Vorath's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. "Very well," Vorath said. "I require a volunteer to serve as the opponent for this demonstration." Before Vorath had even finished the sentence, Nevar stepped forward. The young Draenok noble walked into the ring with the easy confidence of someone who had been told his entire life that he was destined for greatness. He selected a heavy Draenok war staff from the rack, a weapon nearly 6 feet long, made of dense alloy, and spun it once with practiced skill. He was good. Elias could see that immediately. Nevar had real training and real talent and the natural physical advantages of a species built for combat. He outweighed Elias by at least 100 pounds, and had natural armor on his forearms and shins, and the kind of reach advantage that made close fighting almost impossible. Nevar planted himself across the ring from Elias, and smiled that predatory smile. "Try not to bleed on the floor you just cleaned, little creature," Nevar said. A few cadets laughed. Elias said nothing. He pulled the mop head off the handle and set it aside, leaving himself holding a plain wooden stick. Then he shifted his stance. It was a small movement. His feet spread to shoulder width. His knees bent slightly. His weight dropped to his center, and his hands found their positions on the wooden handle with a kind of automatic precision that only comes from doing something 10,000 times. The room went quiet, not because anyone understood what they were seeing, but because something in the air had changed. Something old and heavy and dangerous had just woken up in the middle of a sparring ring on a space station 1,000 light years from a small blue planet, and even species that had no word for it could feel it pressing against their skin like a change in pressure before a storm. Elias looked at Nevar across the ring. His eyes were calm and focused, and completely empty of fear. Vorath raised one hand. "Begin," he said. Nevar attacked first because Draenok always attacked first. It was bred into them, a species-wide instinct that said the one who strikes first controls the fight. And Nevar had been training since he could walk to channel that instinct into devastating opening assaults. He lunged across the ring with his war staff raised high, and brought it down in a diagonal slash aimed at the spot where the human's shoulder met his neck, A textbook Draenok opening strike that combined reach and power and the full weight of a 250-pound reptilian warrior. It was fast. It was brutal. It hit nothing. Elias moved sideways one step, just one step, but he moved at the exact right moment and the exact right angle, and Nivar's war staff cut through empty air where the human had been a half-second before. Nivar's momentum carried him forward, and his body was open for just a fraction of a second. Elias hit him 3 times. The throat. A short, sharp jab with the end of the mop handle that caught the soft scales just below the jaw, where Draenok had no armor. The second was to the inside of the right knee, a quick downward tap to the joint where the leg bent, hitting a nerve cluster that every species with legs seemed to have in roughly the same place. The third was to the wrist, a precise crack across the tendons that controlled grip strength. 3 strikes in less than 2 seconds. The war staff clattered to the floor. Nivar staggered sideways, his right hand numb, his knee buckling, his throat burning, and he tried to turn to face the human, but his body was not cooperating because 3 different parts of it were screaming in pain at the same time. His knees hit the floor. The room was silent. 36 cadets and 1 senior instructor stared at the sparring ring, where a Draenok noble warrior lay gasping on the ground, and a human janitor stood over him, holding an wooden stick, with the calm expression of someone who had just finished a routine chore. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Vorath spoke. "Again," he said, and his voice was different now, the dismissive tone completely gone, replaced by something sharp and focused. A real opponent this time. He did not look at Nivar, who was pulling himself off the floor, with his pride in worse shape than his body. Vorath turned to the far side of the ring, where the largest cadet stood. "Thalox," he said. A Malvari stepped forward. If Nivar had been big, then Thalox was a mountain that had learned to walk. He stood 8 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as a doorway, and arms that looked like they had been carved from granite. His species came from a world with nearly twice the gravity of Earth, which meant his muscles were dense and powerful beyond anything a human could naturally achieve. He weighed over 400 pounds, and every ounce was pure force. Of it was built for breaking things. Thalox did not pick a weapon from the rack. He did not need one. His fists were weapons enough. He stepped into the ring and looked down at Elias the way a boulder looks at a blade of grass. There was no malice in his eyes, because you do not feel malice towards something you are about to step on. "Instructor," Thalox said, in a voice like gravel rolling downhill, "I do not wish to damage the custodial staff permanently." "Then I suggest you try to keep up," Vorath said. Thalox frowned, confused by the response, and then shrugged and set his stance. He was slow to start, like all Malvari, but once moving, he would be like a freight train with fists. Elias did not wait for him to get moving. He darted forward and struck Thalox twice in rapid succession, once on the inside of the left elbow and once on the outside of the right thigh, hitting nerve points with the mop handle, like a doctor hitting a reflex with a hammer. Thalox grunted and swung a backhand that would have taken a normal person's head clean off their shoulders. Elias ducked under it and felt the wind of the massive arm passing over his scalp, and came up behind Thalox's left side, where the Malvari was slow to turn. He struck 3 more times, targeting the joints, always the joints, because you cannot fight a mountain by hitting the mountain, but you can fight a mountain by removing its foundation. Thalox roared and spun, faster than Elias expected, and one enormous hand caught the mop handle in a grip that could crush steel. For one heartbeat they were connected, the human and the giant, linked by a wooden stick that was the only thing between them. Thalox pulled. Elias did not resist the pull. He let the momentum carry him forward and used it, turning the pull into a vault that brought his knee up into the nerve cluster under Thalox's chin, a spot that was unarmored on. Molvari, because their builders had never imagined something small enough to reach it in combat. Thalox's head snapped back, and his grip loosened for just a moment. But a moment was enough. Elias ripped the mop handle free and danced backward out of range, his feet moving in patterns that mixed boxing footwork with something older and more fluid, something the cadets had never seen from any species. Thalox shook his head and charged. This time there was real intent behind it, the Molvari equivalent of taking something seriously. And when 400 pounds of high-gravity muscle decides to charge, there is very little in the galaxy that can stand in front of it and survive. Elias did not try to stand in front of it. He sidestepped and planted the mop handle against the floor at an angle, and used it as a lever to redirect Thalox's momentum, guiding the charging giant past him like a matador guiding a bull. Thalox stumbled, off balance, and swung blindly. His fist connected. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. The glancing blow caught Elias across the ribs and sent him skidding sideways across the ring floor, his feet leaving the ground for a moment before he hit and rolled. Pain exploded through his left side, and he tasted copper in his mouth, and for 1 second, the world went bright and blurry around the edges. The cadets leaned forward. Nivar, still nursing his bruised pride at the edge of the ring, allowed himself a small smile. But Elias rolled and came up on his feet, in one motion. The kind of recovery that you cannot think about, and cannot plan for, and can only do if your body has been trained to do it so many times that it happens without conscious thought. He was hurt. His ribs were probably cracked, but he was standing, and his eyes were clear, and the mop handle was still in his hands. He looked at it. It was a wooden stick, about 5 feet long, light and fragile, designed for cleaning floors on a space station. It was not a weapon. And then Elias did the thing that would be talked about on Korath Prime for years after. He brought the mop handle down across his raised knee and snapped it in two. The crack echoed through the silent hall like a gunshot. Now he held 2 sticks, each about 2.5 feet long, one in each hand. Eskrima sticks. The weapons of a fighting art developed on a chain of islands on a small blue planet by people who had been conquered and disarmed and told they could not have weapons. So they learned to fight with sticks and farming tools and anything else they could find, because the human species had never once in its entire history accepted the idea that being unarmed meant being helpless. Elias settled into a new stance, both sticks held in a guard position that was loose and alive and ready. He moved. What followed was not a fight in any way the cadets understood. It was something else entirely. Elias closed the distance before Thalox could set his stance, and the 2 sticks became a storm of precise strikes that hit from angles Thalox could not track and could not block and could not predict. Left stick to the nerve cluster on the inner arm, right stick to the joint behind the knee, left stick again to the wrist, right stick to the floating rib on the unarmored side. Thalox swung, and Elias was not there. Thalox kicked, and Elias was already behind him. Every movement Thalox made was answered with a counter that was faster and more precise, and targeted exactly the spots where size and strength meant nothing, because the human was not fighting the body, he was fighting the nervous system. Strike, parry, redirect, strike, lock. In 12 seconds it was over. Thalox was on the ground, breathing hard, one broken piece of mop handle pressed gently but firmly against the artery in his throat, and the other pinning his dominant arm to the floor in a joint lock that used leverage instead of strength. The giant could not move without hurting himself. The human, who weighed less than half of what the giant weighed, was in complete control. The hall was so quiet that Elias could hear his own heartbeat and the soft hum of the station's air recyclers. Every cadet in the room was frozen. Shirik's mandibles were clicking so fast, they were nearly vibrating. Nivar's mouth was hanging open, and he did not seem to notice. Vorath walked to the edge of the ring, and stopped. His golden eyes were wide and fixed on the human, and there was an expression on his reptilian face that his cadets had never seen before in all their months of training under him. It was respect, not curiosity, and not amusement, and not surprise. Respect, the deep and earned kind that one warrior gives to another when they have witnessed something real. Stepped into the ring, and stood over the seam, and looked down at Elias, who was bruised and breathing hard, and bleeding slightly from a cut on his forehead, and holding 2 splintered pieces of a cleaning tool against a giant who could not move. "What are you?" Vorath said. It was the same question he had asked before, weeks ago in the supply closet, but it carried a different weight now, because now he was not asking out of suspicion. He was asking out of awe. Elias released Thalux and stood up slowly, wincing at the pain in his ribs, holding the 2 broken pieces of wood at his sides. He looked at Vorath. "I am the janitor, sir," he said. Vorath stared at him for 3 long seconds. Then the corner of his mouth moved, in what might have been the Draenok equivalent of a smile, though nobody in the room had ever seen Vorath smile before, so nobody could be sure. "No," Vorath said quietly, "you are not." The footage spread across Korath Prime like a fire in dry grass. Every cadet in that hall had been wearing a personal recording device, because cadets always wore personal recording devices. And within 1 hour of the demonstration ending, the video of a human janitor dismantling 2 of the Academy's top fighters with a broken mop handle had been shared to every barracks, and every mess hall, and every common room on the station. By the end of the day it had been forwarded to 3 other military installations. By the end of the week, it had reached the Union capital. The title that someone attached to the file was simple, and it stuck: The Janitor of Hall 7. Elias did not know about any of this, because Elias was in the medical bay getting his cracked ribs wrapped, while trying to explain to a very confused alien doctor how he had been injured during custodial duties. The doctor did not believe him, but also did not care enough to investigate. Days later, Vorath submitted a formal petition to the Academy Commandant, a request to reclassify the human custodial worker Elias Ward as an assistant combat instructor for Training Hall 7. The petition was detailed and precise, and written in the dry, formal language of military bureaucracy. But beneath the official wording, it said something very simple. This human is a warrior, and he is wasted pushing a mop. The Academy Commandant was a Thesari named High Director Savath, a political creature who had climbed the ranks not through combat excellence, but through careful management of relationships and optics, and the delicate balance of power between species in the Union. Savath read the petition and denied it within the hour. The reason given was administrative. The human's credentials were classified as unverifiable primitive world experience, and his assigned role was custodial support. And reclassification required a minimum of 6 standard months in the current role plus a formal review by the Interspecies Integration Board. The real reason was political. Humans were a provisional species, and allowing one of them to teach combat to other species would set a precedent that many in the Union would find unacceptable. Vorath received the denial and read it and set it aside, and said nothing because Vorath had been in military institutions long enough to know that politics moved slowly, but events moved fast. And sometimes the best thing to do was wait for events to overtake politics. He did not have to wait long. The interspecies martial demonstration was the most prestigious event on the Academy's calendar. A showcase where top cadets performed combat forms and sparring exhibitions for visiting dignitaries from across the Union. This year, the dignitary list included a name that made even Savath nervous. Union High Marshal Zathari, a Thesari general who was 140 years old and had commanded forces in more conflicts than most species had existed for. Zathari was a legend. She had retired from active command decades ago, but still held enormous influence in the Union's military hierarchy, and her opinion on any matter of combat or training carried more weight than most formal policies. She arrived at Korath Prime 3 days before the demonstration, traveling with a small entourage, and the first thing she did upon arrival was request a private meeting with the human custodial worker from Training Hall 7. Savath nearly choked on his afternoon nutrient blend when he received the request. There was no way to deny it without insulting a high marshal, so Elias was pulled from his duties and escorted to a meeting room on the upper levels of the station, where he had never been allowed before. Zathari was smaller than he expected. She was old, her exoskeleton faded to a pale gray, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of someone conserving energy. They no longer had in abundance. But her compound eyes were sharp, and they fixed on Elias the moment he entered the room, with an intensity that made him feel like he was being scanned down to his bones. "Sit," she said. He sat. "I have watched the recording 17 times," she said. "I have slowed it down and analyzed each movement frame by frame, and I have shown it to 4 combat analysts whose combined experience exceeds 300 years. She paused. "None of them can fully explain what you did." Elias was quiet for a moment. "What would you like to know?" he asked. "Not what you did," Zathari said, leaning forward on the table between them. "I can see what you did, and I can identify most of the individual techniques, even if I cannot name them in your language. But what I cannot understand is the philosophy behind them." She tapped one thin limb on the table. "Every species in the Union fights according to its strengths, because that is how combat has been taught for 1,000 years. And the logic is sound, because why would you not use what nature gave you?" She pointed at Elias. "But your species has nothing, and I mean that with respect, because I have read the biological profiles, and humans have no armor, and no claws, and no venom, and no enhanced speed, and no superior strength, and nothing that any combat analyst would identify as a natural advantage." She tilted her head. "And yet you defeated a Draenok and a Mulvari in the same evening with a cleaning tool. So clearly the profiles are missing something, and I want to know what it is." Elias thought for a long time before answering. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully. "On Earth," he said, "there is a very old history of people being conquered and having their weapons taken away. And every single time this happened, every single time in our history, across every culture and every continent, those people found something else to fight with." He held up his hands. "When swords were taken, they fought with farming tools. When farming tools were taken, they fought with sticks. When sticks were taken, they fought with their bare hands. And when they could not use their hands, they fought with their heads and their teeth and their knees and their elbows." He leaned forward. "We do not have a natural weapon because we do not need one, because our natural weapon is the refusal to ever be unarmed." Zathari was very still. "The mop handle," Elias continued, "was not a compromise, it was a choice, because I wanted them to see that the object does not matter, that anything can become a weapon if the person holding it understands the principles of leverage and timing and anatomy and force." He paused. "And when the mop handle was not enough, I broke it in half and made it into something better, because that is what humans do. We take what is broken, and we turn it into something that works." Zathari said nothing for a very long time. Her compound eyes were unreadable, but the way she held herself, perfectly still with every limb tucked close, was the Thessari posture of deep contemplation, the kind reserved for moments that change the way you understand the world. "I have fought 12 species," she finally said, "and I have commanded forces against 8 more, and every one of them fought according to what they were born with, their claws, or their venom, or their armor, or their strength." She looked at Elias. "I have never encountered a species whose combat doctrine begins with the assumption that they have nothing, and builds everything from there." She stood, slowly, and walked toward the door. "I will be speaking with the commandant," she said. "You will hear from me soon." 2 days later the orders came down. They did not come from Savath. and they did not come from the Academy Review. They came from High Marshal Zethari's office, carrying the weight of a military legend's personal endorsement. And they said simply that the human known as Elias Ward was to be immediately reclassified from custodial support to the rank of Assistant Combat Instructor, Training Hall 7, with full authority to develop and teach human combat methodology to Union cadets. Zabak signed the orders without comment, because there was nothing he could do, and everyone knew it. The morning that Elias walked into Training Hall 7, wearing an instructor's uniform instead of custodial coveralls, the room was already full. Every cadet was there, and some who were not assigned to Hall 7 had found excuses to attend. Vorath stood at the side of the room with his arms crossed and watched. Elias walked to the center of the main ring and looked out at 36 faces, some curious, some skeptical, and some still carrying the sting of what they had witnessed the week before. Nivar was in the front row. The young Draenok noble had a bruise on his throat that was still fading to yellow, and an expression on his face that was hard to read, something between resentment and reluctant respect. Elias held up 2 short wooden sticks, freshly cut from a supply crate. "My name is Instructor Ward," he said, "and the first thing I'm going to teach you is that everything you know about your natural advantages is only half the picture." He looked around the room. "The other half is what you do when those advantages are taken from you." He tossed one of the sticks to Nivar, who caught it reflexively. "Everyone pair up," Elias said. "We start now." The cadets moved. Chirik caught Elias's eye from across the room, and there was something in the Thessari's compound gaze that might have been pride, or might have been vindication, or might have been both. "You did not just win a fight," Chirik said as they passed each other. "You changed what they think humans are." Elias almost smiled. "Someone still has to clean this floor after we are done," he said. Later that evening, long after the cadets had left, Vorath stood on the observation balcony above Training Hall 7 and watched the human below. Elias was alone in the ring with a new mop, cleaning the scuffs and marks that a day of combat training had left on the floor. He mopped with the same quiet efficiency he had always shown, moving across the floor in steady lines, just a man with a mop doing a simple job. But every few steps, his grip would shift on the handle, just slightly, just for a moment, and the mop would become something else in his hands before becoming a mop again. Vorath watched and allowed himself a rare smile. In his 40 years of training warriors from a dozen different worlds, he had never met a species like this one. Every other species in the galaxy had been given something die. Evolution, some natural tool for survival, some biological advantage that defined how they fought and how they thought about fighting. Humans had been given nothing, and so they had learned to use everything. Vorath turned from the balcony and walked back to his office, and as he walked, he passed the weapon rack mounted on his wall. And for the first time in years, he looked at the weapons hanging there and saw them differently. Not as weapons, but as objects. Objects that were only weapons because someone had decided they were. And he thought about a species that looked at a mop and saw the same thing. And he understood at last why the galaxy should pay very close attention to the small soft creatures from the small blue world. Because a species that could find a weapon in anything could never truly be disarmed. And a species that could never be disarmed could never truly be defeated.